Want to find out what's going on in your community? El Observador is San Jose's bilingual weekly newspaper. Go to your local newsstand and pick up your free copy today.
Looking for the training and skills you need to get a new career? Call Center for Training and Careers today. That's CTC at 408-213-0961 and start building your new career today.
I'm Cihuapilli Rose Amador LeBeau, and this is Native Voice TV. Welcome to the show. Today I'd like to welcome Elias Castillo, and Elias is the author of A Cross of Thorns, The Enslavement of California's Indians by the Spanish Missions. Welcome, and tell us what your book's about.
Well, what it is, I'll tell you what it does. It shatters the image of California's missions as these wonderful idyllic places where the friars loved the Indians and the Indians loved the friars, and Junipero Serra was just an angelic person.
What kind of person was he?
Very twisted, very fanatical. He established a brutal treatment of Indians, and he didn't have to. He could have just said, all right, come on in and let's work together. But he didn't. Instead, he wanted them free of sin, and that meant that there was a lot of restrictions, a lot of punishments involving whipping, putting the Indians in stocks for minor infringes that no one would have cared about outside of the missions, and also because he forced them to change their diet. Prior to coming into the missions, the Indians lived on small animals, roots, and some plants. But all of a sudden, he ordered them enslaved in the missions, of which they could never leave. They were once inside, and he baptized them. They could never leave for the rest of their lives.
Now, were they captured and brought into the missions? How were they how were they forced and enslaved to build missions?
What happened was that initially when the Indians first saw them and saw, my gosh, look at those tools and look at those saws. We need some of those tools and some saws. And they decided, gee, it would be good to have some of that material for ourselves. Mm-hmm. And it looked like it'd be fun to living with them. Well, it turns out that that's what they thought, but the reality was that once the ones in the missions, they were taught, the friars taught them how to make sounds. You know, it could be, to them it was just gua gua, but to the friars it was maybe the first letters of our Lord's Prayer. And that's how they did not know what they were saying because they didn't know Spanish. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And they didn't have time to learn it. All they were taught was, let's have them recite the Lord's Prayer or the Rosary. And they would teach them how to do that. And then another friar would come in and then verify that they were that the sounds were like the Lord's Prayer. Once they had done that, then they were quickly baptized. Once they were baptized, they could never leave the missions.
Oh.
Neither their children, or their wives, or their children's children. So they were there for forever. And what eventually began happening was that because the Indians were not immune to European diseases, they quickly were contaminated by the Europeans that were there. Now, these are measles, mumps, influenza, colds. They had no immunity to all of those. And so they quickly began dying. And if they didn't want to work, well, that's tough. Serra's attitude was, yes, you will work, and if you don't work, we're going to whip you. And they did whip them severely for infringements that no one would care about.
And if they wanted to leave?
They couldn't.
They couldn't.
They couldn't because
they would kill them.
They were Spanish. No, they wouldn't kill them. They would just punish them severely, whip them 30, 40 times, including women. And there was one rules is that women are never whipped in public, but are taken to a faraway place that their screams may not incite the men to riot. And that's how they felt. They knew they were doing wrong, that these were people that had done nothing. And then here's the other thing about this. The governors of California, every single of them, were opposed to the missions because they felt the friars, including Serra, were not educating the Indians. They were not teaching them how to read or write so that they could survive in the coming settlement of California. And so and without reading or writing or arithmetic or basic education, they were helpless. They couldn't even count. And then, of course, they were periodically hit with these epidemics, and it would wipe out half the mission. And each mission, eventually, Serra founded 9 missions, and eventually there were 21 missions. Once the 21 missions were founded after Serra died in 1864. But the fact is that each mission had about maybe 1,200 Indians, and they had enormous, huge, vast land holdings.
So were most of them up in, well, I'm not that familiar with where the missions are, but did he found the missions that were in this area? Is that why he's in Cupertino up on the freeway or someplace out there?
No.
With the statue?
He founded 9 missions, and they were scattered all over
California.
All over the Bay Area, just the Bay Area.
Okay.
The missions were founded from here's San Francisco, and here's San Diego. The missions were founded between San Francisco and San Diego.
Wow.
And all 21 of them. And some of them were most of them were close to the coast.
Now, why do you think the story's been changed so many times over the years to the point where it's glamorized, and in schools they have the kids build missions?
Sure. Well, that's because of the big lie, and that's what I'm going to call it from now on, the big lie. In 1880, land developers and real estate types wanted people to come to California from the East Coast. So around that time, a woman wrote a book called Ramona, and it was the story of an Indian couple, and she had written it because she had read Uncle Tom's Cabin and wanted to write something similar because of the tremendous racism and prejudice against the California Indians. So she wrote this book, and the couple are just subjected to racism and insults from the local populace, some of which were white, some of them which were Mexican, some of whom were Spanish. And what they did was, the couple, Ramona and I forget the name of her husband, but they went to a mission, and they wanted to talk to the priest there about, can you help us? Can you help us in our plight, because we have nowhere to go? Because the missions had taken all their family and all their ancestors into the mission. They had died without leaving any trace of their ancestral homes. And so once that link was broken, the Indians who came out of the missions in 1833 really had no place to go because their homes had all been taken by settlers. A lot of their customs just simply dissolved because they put Indians from all tribes in one. In each mission, there were Indians from every tribe.
Right.
And it was very difficult to keep their own customs and their languages and the history of their stories. They had an oral tradition. So everything that they knew was taught to the children, and then they would carry it on. But that wasn't happening in the California missions. And that fact really wiped out tribes that we still don't know anything about. They've just been wiped out, as if they had never existed, as if they had been on another planet. No one knows anything about these.
They wiped out the entire history of the tribes.
Yeah, they wiped out the members. They wiped out anything pertaining that there had ever been a tribe, and these were small tribes. And so what Serra imposed was this very unhinged attitude that he could punish the Indians just as they did in Peru. One time the Governor Neve asked Serra, "Why are you mistreating the Indians like you do?" He says, and this is in the book too. And he answered, "Well, what do you mean? You know, we're just following the example of Saint Francisco Sonoma, who did the same thing against the natives in Peru. And if he had them in the missions, and then if they did something that they disappointed him, then he would whip them. So we're using these tried and true methods, and there's nothing wrong with using that which were used by a saint himself." Well, the problem with that is, one, the extreme cruelty with which it was done. People were lashed up to 40 times, received 40 lashes. 10 lashes is the maximum you can receive. And with 10 lashes, it's just like having a razor blade. Push it into the skin and then wipe right down. It cuts a very wide gap about that, and you bleed a lot. 50 lashes would just about kill you. And and children at the age of 10, children could also be whipped.
Oh my goodness!
And they were considered adults. So you can imagine what did. In 1786, a French expedition, which was sailing through the Pacific Rim to find for France what was there, who were the nations, what were the people like, so forth. They came to Carmel, and one of the things, and they had doctors, botanists, teachers, and one of the things that the doctors found out is, they were giving the children just regular exams. They found out virtually every 10-year-old had a hernia, which meant that they were being forced to carry loads that they could not carry. And in the book, I said, well, these hernias, even in the 1700s, could easily be cured. Might be painful, but they could be easily cured with a very simple surgical procedure. But these children were going to grow up with these hernias that will probably get worse as they grew. The friars didn't care. As long as the children appeared to be working fine, they were all right.
So, Junipero Serra, now was he like the main
he was
person with the missions then?
Right.
Or?
He was considered the Padre Presidente. He was in charge of all 21, eventually of all 9 missions that he established. And he set the policies. There was nothing, absolutely nothing in the commands to him that he enslaved the Indians. But that was himself. That was he. He said, all right, we'll enslave the Indians, and this will guarantee that when they die, we'll keep them free of sin, and they will go to heaven. And
so that's how they excuse it away?
That's how they excuse it.
That's how they excuse it?
Yeah, that's how they excuse it. We've got to keep them free of sin. Every single woman over the age of 10 and women whose husbands were away from the mission itself, working out in some faraway area, were required to be locked in a large room called a convento, which maybe had 2 buckets for a bathroom. And so that might include maybe 100, 150, 250, 300 women packed into these rooms. Well, you can imagine 2 buckets, that these were basically producing bacteria. And that's how the plague got started, because you packed all these human beings into one little room, and they had to sleep there at night. Very, very bad ventilation. And if one had a cold, by morning everyone would be infected. Or if they had some other disease, European disease, they were all infected. And then the next day, those girls or those women that had been in there then infected the rest of the population, and you had an epidemic, and it could take out the entire population in a few weeks.
What made you want to do this book, or write this book, and do this research?
It was the right thing to do, and I felt California needs to have a true history of this. What happened, remember I was telling you about the story of Ramona? Mm-hmm. Well, what happened is they went to the priest and they spent time in the mission, and I think her name was Hunter Jackson. And she wrote such a beautiful description of the mission that everybody thought, oh, these are wonderful things. Except that now they were just piles of adobe brick and rotten timbers. And then someone got the idea, let's restore the missions for California, and that'll attract people to come to California. And so who were the people that helped restore? Was the Stanfords, Crocker, Randolph Hearst, all the wealthy power brokers of.
So it was a tourist attraction.
It was a tourist attraction, right? Come see the missions, and of course, the friars that were left, they didn't want to tell the truth about what had happened, but they knew darn well that underneath their feet there were thousands and thousands of bodies of Indians that had died there, and they kept it secret. They have kept it secret until now. It's not that it's out. I spent 7 years going through the documents of the missions, and that's how I found it. It was a painstaking because I had to. There are books called The Writings of Junipero Serra. Mm-hmm. Every single letter he wrote is in that book. But in order to find out the material I needed to prove my point, I had to read every single letter and study it very carefully, mm-hmm. and then look through all the other letters. Maybe this was just something that was a singularity. But no, it turns out that the more I read, the more I realized that these were brutal death camps. And they were brutal. There's no.
How could the Pope not know this?
Well, that's why I say, how can the Pope Francis, not know about this? Is somebody not telling him?
Can I send him your book? But I mean, this is something they should have in all the schools.
Yes, right.
They need to start teaching history correctly, the correct history, and not the made-up, glamorized version.
And the State Board of Education is at fault also.
I
For
agree.
decades, they have been teaching fourth graders how wonderful the Franciscans were and how wonderful Serra was, and the missions were that they helped develop California. Well, they didn't help develop California. They did just the opposite. That's why the governors, the Mexican governors and the Spanish governors, didn't want anything to do with the missions. They wanted them out of here because they took up eventually 21 missions, and each of them maybe, I estimate, I may be wrong, 300,000, 400,000 acres of land. They took the best land and they kept it for themselves. And their herds, which then trampled the Indians' food, San Juan Capistrano, Luis Rey de Francia was one of the missions down there. And they had a livestock herd. That includes all of the animals they had. That includes cows or cattle, horses, mules, goats, of 35,000 head. And the cattle herds were maybe numbering up to 25, 35,000. Even now, that's an enormous herd. Yeah, maybe the King Ranch, which is a big cattle corporation, may not even have close to that many cattle. And so what they did was they established a trade with New England merchant ships that would come from, of course, New England. Mm-hmm. And they would buy up tallow, which was the fat from the hides. And that tallow was the only lubricant available. So for wagons, putting it on the axle so it wouldn't squeak, you put tallow on it. Mm-hmm. And the hides were used for leather, of course, which was, I guess you could say, the plastic of that time. And then, let's see, and then the horns were even used. They bought enormous amounts of horn because they could then be cut into combs and cover the backs of brushes and other toilet articles. And so these ships would come in and they would buy enormous quantities of this. And then, of course, and who was enriched by these? The missions.
The churches.
And the fact, that the missions try to put across the story that the missions were very poor and that everything went to help the Indians. Well, that's not true because in my research I found a description of this merchant captain is in there, and he gets his gold coins out to pay the priests, and the priest said, "Oh no, we can't do that. We're Franciscans. We can't touch money, and that's money. It would be it's against our trust." So the foreman is in the same room, and so the priests, the merchant then leaves, and the foreman, he walks out with the foreman, and then he asks the foreman, what's this about the Franciscans can't touch money? He says, "Oh, don't believe them. What they do is, now that we're going, they will take those gold coins into their bedroom, and they will throw them on the bed and count them, make sure that's all there, and then put them in their storehouse, and they're safe." Or
all
just
lies.
A big, all lies. Yeah.
You mentioned that one of the last, was it one of the last friars, they sent a letter to the Mexican government telling them, explaining what was going on in the missions?
That was Mariano Palleras, was the last Spanish Padre Presidente of the missions. And what the governors, I think it was Sola, became very angry at the missions. He said, "Now you are in the midst of this terrible death toll that goes on continually in the missions. Now I want this stopped." And he just said, "I want this stopped." And Palleras said that it was the death toll is so bad that the governor ordered it stopped. And what he said was that he wrote to a superior of Mexico City and said, "Now we've got to stop this because or else we have to come up with an excuse to explain why so many Indians have died. And what we've got to do is find, he didn't say in so many words, I'm paraphrasing, we need to find an excuse as to why this is happening, because if we don't, we're going to be subjected to scorn and scandal. And we will be blamed for the death of all the heathendom that once populated the coast. He says, all we have done is consecrate them, baptize them, and bury them. And now there are no more Indians outside of the missions on the coast. We have wiped them out, and they do not survive. Within a year, they're dead in the missions that we have now. And so that letter is critically important to the understanding that here was the hierarchy, Father Presidente of all 21 missions, blaming the missions for the deaths and the disappearance of the Indians. He said there are very few Indians under the age of 20 in the mission. They just die. And it is a shocker to me.
Well, thank you for all of the work and research you've done. I know you've invested so many years into this. And it's a book that everybody has to read, and get the kids to read this in the high schools, and we need to get this in the high schools.
State Board of Education needs
Absolutely.
to change it.
And the other thing, too, is I've been seeing a lot of petitions online to the Pope. Mm-hmm. He's saying, he's like Hitler. How could you do such a thing,
Yeah, right.
And as you see these petitions, sign them, send a letter, do what you can. Mm-hmm. Pick up a copy of A Cross of Thorns and read it. I can't wait to start reading it.
Well,
thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. Mm-hmm. And thank you for all the work you've done. Thank you for joining us. And you can also pick up a copy at eliasacastillo.net. But make sure you read this book. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next week.